Dakota Territory, October 1883. Lars Ericsson was laying his chimney on the floor. To any man of the prairie, it was an act of profound madness. He worked with a quiet, unhurried precision that made the entire spectacle even more unsettling. He wasn't a builder, not by trade. He was a Norwegian, new to the vast, unforgiving emptiness of the plains. He had the pale eyes of a man who had spent his life looking at the sea, not the squint of a man used to the endless horizon of grass. His neighbors watched. They came by on the pretense of welcoming him, but they stayed to stare at the absurdity unfolding within the four walls of his new cabin. He was cementing a long black stovepipe into a bed of river stones, creating a 30-foot-long metal serpent that snaked from his small iron stove near the front door to the far wall of the main room. Only there, at the very end, did it turn upwards to exit through the roof. Thomas Miller, the man who had built half the county and consulted on the other half, stood with his arms crossed, his face a mask of professional pity. He saw a fool wasting good pipe and better time. He saw a fire hazard. He saw a family that would surely freeze or suffocate before the first real snows of winter. The whispers started at the trading post, turning into open jokes over lukewarm coffee. They called it Ericsson's folly. Some, more poetic in their mockery, called it the serpent stove. The name stuck. It was a joke that held a dark premonition. Everyone knew what a Dakota winter did to the unprepared. It did not forgive mistakes. It did not suffer fools. But what did this quiet Norwegian, this former shipwright from a land of fjords and ice, understand about heat that every seasoned plainsman had missed? What secret was he building into the floor of his cabin? A secret that would be tested not by opinion or mockery, but by the coldest air the continent could produce. The answer was buried in that long, foolish-looking bench of stone and clay, waiting for the winter to ask its question. If you believe forgotten wisdom holds the key to modern problems, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. You are in for a story of fire, ice, and the quiet genius of a man who refused to bend to convention. To understand the madness of Lars Ericsson's design, you first had to understand the brutal physics of a Dakota winter. It was not simply cold, it was an active, predatory force. It was a cold that broke steel, split ancient oaks, and froze running water solid in minutes. It was a pressure, a physical weight that pressed in on a cabin from all sides, seeking every crack, every nail hole, every poorly chinked log. The settlers fought it with fire. The centerpiece of every cabin was the cast iron stove, a black, squat god that demanded constant sacrifice. A family's life was measured in cords of wood. The rhythm of winter was the swing of the axe, the creak of the wood sled, and the roar of the fire. But the fire was a desperate, inefficient thing. The conventional wisdom was simple and, on its face, logical. Smoke is hot, and it rises. Therefore, the stovepipe must go straight up and out. A short vertical flue created a powerful draft, pulling smoke out of the cabin quickly and preventing the occupants from choking. This was the established science of the frontier. It was repeated as gospel by every builder, including Thomas Miller. It was obvious, it was true, and it was catastrophically flawed. A short, hot flue was an open wound. The very draft that cleared the smoke also sucked the heated air from the cabin, pulling cold replacements in through every crack. Worse, the fire's most valuable product, its searingly hot exhaust gas, spent mere seconds inside the home before rocketing out the chimney and dissipating into the indifferent sky. Settlers were, in effect, heating the entire Dakota Territory. They sat huddled near a roaring stove that scorched their faces while their backs remained cold. A rime of frost would creep across the blankets in the morning. Ink froze in its wells. Water left in a bucket just 10 feet from the fire would be solid by dawn. They were burning a winter's worth of wood every month, engaged in a battle of attrition they could never truly win. They were surviving, but they were not living. They were besieged. Lars Ericsson had never built a cabin. He had never chopped oak on the frozen prairie. His experience was with iron, steam, and salt water. For 20 years, he had worked as a marine engineer on steamships crossing the North Atlantic. His world was one of boilers, pistons, and pressure gauges. On a ship, fuel was life. Every lump of coal was precious. The goal of a marine boiler was not just to make fire, it was to wring every last calorie of heat from that fire and convert it into motive force. A ship's engineer who wasted heat was a man who endangered the entire vessel. They understood that the hot gas leaving the combustion chamber was not waste. It was unused fuel. Lars looked at the standard Dakota cabin and he didn't see a home. He saw a terribly designed engine. He saw a boiler with its main steam valve stuck wide open, venting all its power uselessly into the sky. He knew that the problem wasn't the cold outside. The problem was the profound inefficiency inside. He wasn't building a home for his family. He was building a better engine for living. The build began in the late summer, when the ground was still soft enough to dig clay from the creek bed. Lars worked alone, his wife Anya bringing him water and bread. Their 2 children, Solveig and Finn, played nearby, treating the growing structure as their personal fortress. He started not in the center of the room, but against the long north wall, the wall that would bear the brunt of the winter wind. There, he laid a foundation of flat field stones. On this, he placed his stove, a small, unassuming Norwegian model, far smaller than the great pot-bellied stoves his neighbors favored. Its key feature was not size, but its airtight door and damper system. It was designed for control. From the back of this stove, the great work began. He attached the first section of black stovepipe, but instead of pointing it to the sky, he laid it horizontally. He nested it on a carefully prepared bed of sand and smaller river stones, creating a channel. Piece by piece, the metal tube grew, running 30 feet along the base of the wall. He gave the pipe a slight, almost imperceptible incline, no more than a 1/4 inch of rise for every foot of run. This was a detail born of his steamfitter's knowledge. It was just enough to encourage the hot, buoyant gases to move forward, but not so much that it would create a fast, wasteful draft. He wanted the smoke to linger. He wanted it to be lazy. This was the point where Thomas Miller made his first official visit. He wasn't there to mock, not yet. He was there out of a genuine, fatherly concern for the new family. He stood in the doorway, his large frame filling the space, and watched Lars fit another section of pipe. "Son," Miller began, his voice gentle but firm, "I don't mean to tell a man his business in his own home, but that won't draw." Lars paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a clay-stained hand. He looked at Miller, his expression neutral. Smoke needs to go up, Miller continued, stepping inside and pointing at the horizontal pipe. And it needs to stay hot. You lay it flat like that, the smoke will cool, it'll get heavy, and it'll back right out of your stove and into this room. You'll choke your family out before the first frost. It was a sound argument, based on a century of fireplace and stove construction. Lars nodded slowly, considering the words. It will be warm enough to rise at the end, he said, his English still thick with the rhythms of his native tongue. Miller shook his head, his concern deepening. That's my other point, Lars. If you do manage to get it to draw, that long run will cool the smoke too much. You know what happens then? Creosote. The wood gas will condense on the inside of that pipe. You're building a 30-foot fuse. One hot fire, and the whole thing will go up like a cannon barrel. I've seen it take a whole cabin down in 20 minutes. This was not speculation. This was the voice of hard-won experience. Chimney fires were a real and terrifying danger. Miller's logic was by all known standards flawless. The fire will be small, Lars replied, and complete. He gestured to the airtight stove. It will burn clean. He then began the second, even stranger, phase of the construction. He started to build a bench over the entire length of the stovepipe. He used a mixture of clay, sand, and straw, packing it tightly around and over the pipe. Then he faced the entire structure with more fieldstones, mortaring them with the same creek-bed clay. When he was finished, he had a low, massive stone and earth bench, 18 inches high and 2 feet wide, that ran the length of his main room. It looked ancient, like a feature from a Viking longhouse. Miller came back one last time, just as Lars was finishing. He saw the bench and simply sighed. "You've buried it," he said, his voice flat with resignation. "Any heat that pipe makes is now trapped in that pile of mud and rock. The heat needs to get into the air, son. That's how you warm a room. That's how it works." "The stone will hold the heat," Lars said, his standard, simple reply. "It will work after the fire is out." Miller placed a hand on Lars's shoulder. "I wish you luck, son. I truly do. But when this fails, and it gets cold, you come to me. I'll help you rip it out and put in a proper stove before your children get sick." He left, convinced he had just witnessed the prelude to a preventable tragedy. The story was now complete. The tale of the crazy Norwegian building a stone tomb for his chimney became the season's favorite piece of gossip. Eriksson's folly was no longer just a project, it was a landmark. People rode out of their way to see it. Lars was treated with a strange mix of pity and suspicion. He was an outsider, and this project was a declaration that he did not intend to learn their ways. He was stubborn, he was proud, and, everyone agreed, he was wrong. His wife Anya faced the whispers at the trading post. His children heard the other kids laughing about their rock pile in the house. But Lars remained impassive. He finished chinking the logs of his cabin, stacked his firewood, a surprisingly small pile compared to his neighbors, and waited. He had not built a fireplace. He had built a system, and now was the time to explain its secret, if only to ourselves. The system worked on two principles that were alien to frontier construction, but were the bedrock of industrial engineering: maximizing heat exchange and utilizing thermal mass. First, the heat exchange. In a conventional stove, the journey of the hot gas from the fire to the outside world was perhaps 15 feet, and it took less than 3 seconds. In Eriksson's folly, that journey was over 30 feet long. The lazy draft created by the slight incline meant the gas moved slowly, taking maybe 30 or 40 seconds to travel the length of the pipe. This was the genius of it. He had increased the time the hot gases spent inside the cabin by a factor of 10. For that entire duration, the 2,000-degree gas was transferring its energy through the metal wall of the pipe to the surrounding mass. Second, the thermal mass. This was the principle Miller had completely misunderstood. Heat in the air is fleeting. As soon as the fire dies down, the air cools rapidly. It's a temporary warmth. Lars hadn't trapped the heat in the stone bench. He had stored it. The clay and rock acted like a battery for thermal energy. Over hours, it soaked up the steady, moderate heat from the long stovepipe. It absorbed it slowly, and crucially, it released it slowly. The stone bench became a massive, gentle radiator. It warmed the room not with hot, dry air, but with radiant heat, the same kind of heat you feel from sun-warmed stone. This radiant heat warmed the objects in the room, the floor, the furniture, the people, creating a deep, pervasive comfort that airborne heat could never match. The fire itself could be kept small and efficient. In the airtight stove, the wood wasn't just burned, it was gasified, leading to a more complete combustion that consumed the very tars and gases that would form creosote in a cooler flue. By the time the exhaust finally reached the vertical chimney at the end of its long journey, it was no longer a searing blast of wasted energy. It was a mild, placid stream of air, having given up 80 or 90% of its heat to the stone battery running through the heart of the home. Lars Eriksson had built a thermal engine, and he was about to turn it on. The winter arrived as it always did, with a series of hardening frosts and biting winds. The settlers settled in for the long fight, stuffing rags into cracks and feeding their hungry stoves. The folly performed well enough, keeping the Eriksson cabin comfortable with a surprisingly small amount of wood. But this was just the preliminary bout. The true test, the main event, was yet to come. It arrived in the second week of January. Meteorologists would later call it the Great Arctic Outbreak of 1884. The settlers had a simpler name for it, the White Death. It began not with a storm, but with an unnatural calm. The sky took on a pale, crystalline gray, and the air grew so still you could hear a dog bark a mile away. The temperature at dawn was 5 degrees Fahrenheit. By noon, it was -10. By sunset, with a rising wind that sounded like tearing canvas, the mercury in Thomas Miller's thermometer had retreated to the bottom of its bulb. It read -28. This was a new kind of cold. It was a cold that felt like a living thing. It found its way through the thickest wool coats, through leather and log. It made the simple act of breathing painful. Exposed skin would freeze in less than a minute. Inside the cabins of the settlement, a desperate battle was being waged. The conventional stoves, which had been adequate before, were now revealed for what they were, open holes to the sky. To keep the indoor temperature above freezing, they had to be run white hot. The iron sides glowed a dull cherry red, devouring split logs in minutes. The roar of the draft was a constant, hungry sound. Families burned through a week's supply of wood in a single night. The heat was intense and localized. You could scorch your shins while the back of your neck felt the icy draft pulling across the floor. Away from the stove, the cabins were Arctic caves. Water barrels, even those kept indoors, froze solid. Potatoes stored in the root cellars turned to icy rocks. Section-section. In his own sturdy home, the one he'd built with his own hands as a testament to his craft, Thomas Miller was failing. He watched his wife cradle their youngest son, who was racked with a feverish cough. The boy's breath plumed in the air of their own bedroom. Miller had stuffed every crack, hung every blanket he could spare over the doors and windows, but the cold bled through the very logs themselves. His woodpile, which he had thought mountainous in October, was shrinking at a terrifying rate. He was already calculating what would go next: the split-rail fence, the old rocking chair, the boards from the loft. The cold was stripping away their lives, reducing all their hard work and planning to a simple, brutal equation of fuel versus time. And through his own exhaustion and fear, a thought began to gnaw at him. The Norwegian. Lars Eriksson. He thought of that foolish stone bench and the ridiculously small stove. He imagined the family huddled together, their fire long since extinguished, freezing in the dark. He had warned the man. He had tried to help, but a chilling thought took hold. What if the man's pride had been so great that he had refused to admit his mistake? What if his family was in mortal danger right now because everyone, including himself, had laughed instead of intervened? The guilt was a cold stone in his gut, colder than the air outside. He had to know. He had to go and see. Whether to offer rescue or to witness a tragedy he felt partly responsible for, he wasn't sure. But he had to go. Stay with me, because what Thomas Miller found when he opened that cabin door would not only shatter his understanding of the world, it would transform the lives of everyone on the prairie. If you're enjoying this dive into forgotten engineering, show your support and hit that like button right now. Your click helps us bring more of these incredible stories to light. Pulling on every layer of wool and leather he owned, Miller stepped out into the teeth of the wind. The 50 yards to the Eriksson cabin felt like a mile. The wind drove ice crystals into his exposed skin like needles. The snow was frozen into a concrete hard crust that groaned under his boots. The world was a screaming vortex of white and gray. He reached the cabin, a low silhouette against the swirling snow. He saw no signs of panic, no smoke pouring from the chinking, which would indicate a desperate, out-of-control fire. But what he did see was more alarming. From the top of the short chimney, only the barest wisp of smoke emerged. It was a thin, lazy ribbon, almost invisible against the gray sky. To Miller, that meant a dying fire, a fire on the verge of extinguishing. His heart sank. He was too late. He hammered on the thick wooden door, his gloved fist making a dull thud. He expected no answer. He was already planning how he would force the door, how he would carry the children out. The latch clicked. The door swung inward. It was not the cold, dead air of a tomb that met him. It was a silent, solid wave of warmth. It rolled over him, a physical presence that seemed to push the Arctic back. It was not the scorching, aggressive heat of his own overdriven stove. It was a gentle, pervasive, life-giving warmth that wrapped around him like a blanket. He stumbled inside, pulling the door shut against the howling wind, and blinked in the soft lantern light, his mind struggling to process the scene before him. Lars Eriksson was sitting on a stool wearing a simple wool shirt with the sleeves rolled up past his elbows. He was calmly carving a wooden bird for his daughter. In the corner, his wife Anya was humming softly as she kneaded a great mound of bread dough on a flour-dusted table. A kettle on the small stove let out a gentle hiss. And then Miller saw it, the detail that broke his reality. The two Erickson children, Solveig and Finn, were sitting on the floor in the middle of the room, playing with wooden blocks. They were barefoot. Barefoot, on a day when the temperature was nearly 40 degrees below zero. Miller looked from their bare feet to the wooden floorboards, to the windows. The glass was clear. There was no frost on the panes, not a single filigree of ice. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the interior log wall. It wasn't cold. It felt neutral, almost warm. His builder's mind, reeling from the shock, took over. He was no longer a neighbor. He was an investigator. He ignored the family and walked slowly, deliberately, the length of the room. He came to the source of the impossible warmth. The long, low bench of stone and clay. Erickson's folly. He knelt down and placed his bare palm flat against the fieldstones. The warmth that met his hand was astounding. It was not a searing heat that he had to pull away from. It was a deep, radiant, and utterly steady warmth. It felt like a living thing, breathing heat into the room. It was the warmth of a sun-baked rock on a perfect summer afternoon, and it was emanating from every inch of this 30-foot-long structure. He looked at the stove. The fire door had a small glass window. Inside, a small fire of just 2 logs burned, not with a roar, but with a calm, clean, orange-blue flame. It was a fire sipping fuel, not gulping it. Miller stood up and turned to Lars, his eyes wide with a dawning, terrifying understanding. All his experience, all his hard-earned knowledge, was a lie. He had been building cold houses his entire life. His practical mind seized on the only metric that mattered. "Lars," he said, his voice hoarse, "your wood. How much wood have you burned since the cold hit?" Lars looked up from his carving and gestured with his knife toward a wooden box near the door. "We have used little. I filled the box 2 days ago." Miller strode over to the wood box. It was, as the man said, still more than 3/4 full. Miller's own wood box, 4 times the size, was one he had to refill 3 times a day. The numbers didn't add up. They were impossible. He felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if the fundamental laws of the universe had been rewritten in this small, warm cabin. Lars must have seen the disbelief on his face. He walked to the wall and pointed at a small, brass-cased thermometer hanging from a nail. Miller leaned in close to read the delicate markings. The needle was steady, unwavering. It pointed to 68 degrees. 68 degrees. A comfortable room temperature in the heart of a storm that was killing livestock in their barns. A temperature differential of over 100 degrees from the outside world, maintained by a tiny, lazy fire. The numbers were undeniable. The proof was in the air he was breathing, in the warmth on his skin, in the sight of 2 barefoot children playing happily on the floor. Thomas Miller, the respected expert, the pillar of the community, turned to face the quiet Norwegian immigrant. The mockery of the town, his own confident predictions of disaster, his pity, it all crashed down on him. He felt the hot shame rise in his cheeks. He had not just been wrong. He had been arrogant. He had been blind. "I was wrong," Miller said. The 2 words were the heaviest he had ever lifted. They were a confession, an apology, and a plea all at once. Lars, my God, I was completely and utterly wrong. He took a step closer, his eyes no longer those of a skeptic, but of a student. This is not folly. This is genius. You have to teach me how it works. You have to teach all of us. When the great cold snap finally broke, the stories that emerged were grim. Tales of loss, of frostbite, of harrowing survival. But one story was different. It was the story of the warm cabin. Thomas Miller, a man whose word was as solid as the foundations he laid, became the folly's greatest apostle. He told the story everywhere, to everyone who would listen. He described the wave of warmth, the barefoot children, the full wood box. He didn't just recount the miracle. He explained the principle, using his own authority as a builder to lend weight to Lars's strange design. The mockery surrounding Ericsson's folly evaporated, replaced by a sense of awe and urgent curiosity. That spring, Miller was the first to arrive at Lars's door, not with advice, but with a request for instruction. Together, they spent a week retrofitting Miller's own home. They ripped out the old, inefficient stove and built a new bench along his longest wall. Lars showed him how to mix the clay to the right consistency, how to set the pipe at the perfect, gentle incline. When they were done, Miller's house was transformed. The following autumn, the first chill winds were met not with a roaring fire, but with the slow, steady warmth of the thermal mass. His wood consumption dropped by 70%. Word spread like a prairie fire. What had once been a spectacle of foolishness became the new standard of frontier innovation. The derisive nickname was forgotten, replaced by a name spoken with respect: the Ericsson bench. Soon, families all over the county were undertaking the project. The community, which had once united in mocking Lars, now united in learning from him. The landscape of the settlement began to change. New cabins were built from the ground up with the bench as an integral part of their design. The sight of a massive woodpile, once a symbol of a man's foresight and industry, now looked like a sign of inefficiency. Lars Ericsson never sought fame or payment. He was, at his core, a quiet man who had simply wanted to keep his family safe and warm. He shared his knowledge freely, answering questions and helping neighbors with the heavy lifting, but he never presented himself as an inventor. He was just a man who understood how an engine worked. When asked about his design, he would often just shrug and say, "On a ship, you do not waste the steam." The true legacy of his work wasn't measured in cords of wood saved or degrees of temperature gained. It was measured in human lives. It was measured in the babies who survived their first winter, in the elderly who no longer had to sleep beside the fire, in the children who could play freely in their own homes without fear of the cold. It was measured in the simple, profound dignity of being warm and secure in the face of one of nature's most powerful and relentless forces. The story of Lars Ericsson is a powerful reminder that sometimes the most revolutionary ideas come from the quietest corners, from outsiders who see the world through a different lens. His solution was not about a bigger fire or thicker walls. It was about a smarter, more patient understanding of energy. It was a victory of observation over tradition, of empirical evidence over popular opinion. The principles behind the Ericsson bench are not relics of the past. They live on today. You can see the ghost of that long stone bench in modern masonry heaters, in rocket mass heaters, and in the core concepts of passive solar design. The fundamental idea of capturing waste heat and storing it in thermal mass is now at the forefront of sustainable and efficient engineering. The quiet Norwegian shipwright was simply a century ahead of his time. If this story changed the way you think about a simple problem like staying warm, hit that like button. Subscribe for more tales of forgotten wisdom and the unsung innovators of our past. And let me know in the comments, what's the coldest winter you've ever had to face? The story you have just heard is a fictionalized account created for educational and entertainment purposes. While the engineering principles of thermal mass and heat exchange as described are real and historically practiced in various forms, the characters, names, specific events, and location are products of creative storytelling. This content does not constitute professional engineering or construction advice.